Change is inevitable. Now, certainly this quote from famous American author John C. Maxwell can be applied to an awful lot of things, but it certainly can be applied to the trucking industry in the last number of years. This video is sponsored by Driving Tests. Certainly there have been all sorts of changes in the trucking industry in the last number of years, and the face of trucking has virtually changed. Now, in the heyday of trucking, which is truly from about 1970 till about the year 2000, there have been multiple changes, but they all have one common denominator. They all have one thing in common. All the changes that have taken place in the trucking industry since then have benefited either the trucking companies or the shippers and receivers or the DOT or the designers and the electronic experts, but they have not ever once benefited the truck driver. Trucking in the 70s was at that point still what the government considered to be a regulated industry. And the government controlled all the rates of the freight that trucks all hauled, with the exception of a few exempt commodities like food and produce and things like that. But generally, the government controlled the freight rates and the trucking. Now, back then, the drivers primarily were either teamsters or young farm boys off the farm that were comfortable with heavy equipment and driving stuff, and they would haul their dad's produce around off the farm, or they were made up of gearhead types that just really liked the trucks, liked working on the equipment, had no problem with traveling across the country and getting paid to do so. They were generally self-taught drivers, or drivers that were taught by their fathers or their uncles or an older driver, and they were mentored. So they would teach themselves, but mentored by older drivers as they went along, and their skills progressed accordingly. Now, truck drivers back then were upper middle wage earners, and they were a respected part of the society because the money was good. They all pretty much owned their own homes or owned the farms that they lived on, and the general public back then recognized the fact that truck drivers were important in the fact that they relied on them for receiving everything. Their clothes, their food, everything. Society relied on truck drivers. The general public recognized that fact, and truck drivers were respected for that reason. In the 70s, diesel fuel was 45 cents a gallon. The highways were generally a safe place to be, and so were the destinations, with the exception of a couple like Hunts Point or Compton or the Jersey Docks. But other than a few exceptions, it was safe to go everywhere. And every truck driver worth his salt back then followed and read a magazine called Overdrive Magazine. It was published by Mike Parkhurst out of California. Everybody that was worth their salt read that magazine. I just want to take a quick moment here to tell you a little bit about our sponsor. And if you're a new guy that's worried about passing your CDL test, don't be. Driving Tests has developed an online training program that will help you get your ELDT certification and help you with your CDL knowledge exam. Driving Tests is certified by the FMCSA and is recognized as America's #1 online provider of driver CDL training tests. Check them out at drivingtest.org. Fast forward to 2022, the trucking industry has now deregulated, which means that anybody can go get their own operating authority and haul whatever they want, wherever they want. The truck driving force is no longer an upper middle income class earner category. Generally now, truck drivers are lower income earners, and they're staffed mainly by Americans that have been laid off by their factory jobs, because we buy everything from China now, and from immigrants that have come to America for the first time and they need their first job, and they'll work for relatively little money, and that's who's driving the trucks these days. No longer are the truck drivers mentored by the older drivers and self-taught. These days, truck drivers are generally a product of the CDL mills that are staffed and owned by the great big mega carriers. Today in 2022, the Teamsters are a shadow of their former selves, and that all started to slide after Jimmy Hoffa died in 1975 to the point this day where there are very few Teamsters at all. The crime rate in the United States has just soared exponentially. in the last 50 years, so the highways are no longer a safe place to be. And the destinations, all sorts of them now, are not safe, especially after dark. And the camaraderie of truck drivers has now disappeared with the different cultural groups involved in trucking because they can't communicate well with one another, and nobody uses a CB radio anymore to talk across the highway. That's been lost, and that was a big part of that camaraderie. In the 1970s, truck drivers had very few rules. Really, the only rules were, get there as quickly as you can, but get there safely. That was rule number one, get there safely. Rule number two, don't run overweight. And rule number three was, if you do run overweight, don't get caught. And those were basically all the rules that we had to live with. Drivers managed their own time schedules, and they weren't micromanaged by a trucking company the way they are. They got there, when they got there, there were plenty of big, safe truck stops so they could land wherever they wanted and get plenty of food or rest or fuel, whatever they needed. The Iowa 80 opened up in 1962 and continued to grow and grow. The Petro chain opened up in 1975, and they just continued to grow and add on truck stop locations all over the place. And there were mom and pop truck stops everywhere, and the food was good, there was lots of parking. There were changes going on even then, because truck stops like the Union 76, which at one time was the mainstay truck stop of all truck drivers, they folded their doors in 1993 because they couldn't compete. And in 2007, the Petro was bought out by the TA truck stops, and we all bemoaned that fact because the Petros were far better than the dumpier TAs. But on whole, life was good, the fuel was cheap, we had lots of safe parking, lots of good food, and the money was good. Today for truck drivers, life is not quite so good. The fuel is hugely expensive. Most of the good truck stops have closed down, or the ones that are still around offer basically fast food and not much more. There's a shortage of parking, and generally what parking is available is paid parking, and truck drivers are now managed rather than a get there safely but get there as soon as you can. Now they're managed by a just-in-time delivery system, and they're micromanaged and over-monitored by all these driver-facing dash cameras and ELDs, and they can't even drive their own trucks anymore. They're assisted with stuff like braking assist, to the point that the truck drivers aren't even driving the trucks. There's been a loss of control, and there's been a loss of freedom, and truck drivers don't like that. The trucks themselves aren't nearly as reliable as they were back in the day, and it seems these days that the big carriers have a tendency to show a lack of respect for their drivers, and it's not uncommon for them to sit drivers for days at a shipper and not pay them for anything at all. And that never would have happened in truckers' heyday back from the 70s to the 90s. Drivers would have either been paid for that time or they'd have just gotten fed up and left. And the face of trucking isn't done changing yet. These days, we're looking at the introduction of electric trucks, and that'll come to be in the future at some point when they get all the bugs out of them. But even further down the road, we may be looking at autonomous trucks, and when autonomous trucks come in, that will be the end of trucking as far as I'm concerned, because when there's no truck drivers, there's no trucking. It just becomes robotics. But that might not be for the worst, because truck driver pay has not kept up with the cost of living, no matter whether you're a company driver or an owner-operator or an independent. So perhaps we're really not going to be missing anything at all here. In the face of these changes in the trucking industry, with the loss of pay, when you look at the cost of living, this has in turn lowered the driver's quality of life. Not only that, the independence that most guys got into the trucking industry for has been lost with the micromanagement of the electronic equipment. Truck driving is now the most dangerous job in America, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics last year. And there's been a huge liability that's come along these days with truck drivers and the accidents they get involved in. Whether it's their fault or the fault of the four-wheeler, the truck drivers seem to have inherited some of that liability. In fact, I did a video about driver liability. Check it out. It's called, "Are You Willing to Go to Jail for Your Truck Driving Job?" Because of the reasons I've just listed, it's no wonder the trucking companies in certain segments are having trouble recruiting and retaining drivers. You know, all these changes in the face of trucking in the last number of years, you can talk to most people and they'll tell you they call that progress. But what I see is just a gradual disappearance of a great American workforce. Stay safe. Yes, the face of trucking is changing, but truckers are tough people and they'll stay with it and roll with it till the end. Keep the rubber side down. I'll see you on the backhaul.